The Night Stalker, one of California's most horrible offenders and a monster, even by serial killer standards. Richard Ramirez earned the name of the Night Stalker by breaking into homes in the dead of night and committing horrible crimes to innocent people. A traumatic childhood and negative influences growing up helped mold him into the monster he became. In this video, we will dive into the life of Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker. Please be aware, the following video contains descriptions of crimes committed by Richard Ramirez and includes discussions of sexual assault, rape, gore, child sexual assault, and brutal murders. Richard Ramirez was born Ricardo Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children and born to a Mexican couple who immigrated to the U.S. named Mercedes Munoz and Julian Tapia Ramirez. Richard's home life as a boy was not easy and it wasn't good to him. Richard's father, Julian, was a railroad laborer and also a raging alcoholic. Prone to episodes of aggression and anger on his wife and children, Richard was beaten unconscious and to the verge of death multiple times as a young boy. Even before he turned 6 years old, he was beaten mercilessly by his father. Richard was also introduced to smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol at the young age of 10. At age 12, Richard started to grow closer to an older cousin who took him in under his wing. This cousin was named Miguel Angel Valles, nicknamed Mike. Mike was a decorated Green Beret who served in the U.S. Army. Mike was nowhere near a positive role model for a young and impressionable and abused Richard, because Mike himself was a serial killer and serial rapist during his time overseas in the Vietnam War. Mike would brag and retell his gruesome war crimes in Vietnam to Richard. Mike showed Richard Polaroid pictures he kept of Vietnamese women he had raped, decapitated, and dismembered. Allegedly, in these photographs, the women were tied to trees and posts before Mike would sexually assault them and murder them after. Richard recalled being fascinated by the Polaroids and the stories instead of being disgusted and scarred. Mike would also show Richard several tactics he learned as a Green Beret to move stealthily and tactically, and also how to kill a person, which Richard would later go on to utilize as an adult. Richard and Mike grew apart for a short while because during this time, Richard sought to distance himself from his father by sleeping in the local cemetery. After a couple years, a now 14-year-old Richard and Mike reconnected. Richard and Mike continued to bond over drugs and alcohol. Around this time, Richard also began to use LSD frequently and started to develop an interest in Satanism and the occult. Reaching puberty, what should have been a normal progression into sexual curiosity and maturity, was instead deranged sexual fantasies, often blended together with graphic violence, murder, gore, and forced bondage. Richard got a job at a local Holiday Inn and began his aggressive crimes. Richard would use his master key to unlock rooms and rob patrons while they slept. At a minimum, it was confirmed that Richard had molested 2 children in an elevator but was never reported. There was also another instance where Richard attempted to rape a woman while she was sleeping in her room, but was caught by the woman's husband and beaten. Richard was quickly fired from his job at the hotel, and the couple dropped the charges against him, but only because they would not return to the state of Texas to testify against him. At just the age of 15, Richard was at Mike's home, where he witnessed Mike murder his wife, Jessie Valles, by shooting her in the face over a domestic dispute. Richard recalls feeling fascinated and in awe of the shooting instead of feeling trauma or fear. After this, Richard became more withdrawn from his friends and family. Richard also ended up dropping out of high school his freshman year, just before the school year ended. Mike never faced punishment for his crimes. He was deemed mentally insane, and the murder of his wife was blamed on PTSD. Mike was confined to the Texas State Mental Hospital for a couple of years. Richard ended up moving in with his older sister and her husband, Ruth and Roberta. Roberta was a pervert and obsessive peeping Tom. Roberta would take teenage Richard on his night escapades around the neighborhood, where they would spy on women in their homes. After Mike was released from the mental hospital, all 3 of them would go on night walks to spy on women. Fast forward to 1982, Richard is now 22 years old and decided to move to California. While in California, Richard discovered cocaine and fell in love with it. Richard turned to thievery to fund his love for cocaine. Richard resided in both Northern California and Southern California, more specifically in San Francisco when he was in Northern California, and Los Angeles County when he was in Southern California. He would frequently travel up and down the state, both before and during his year-long crime spree. Richard's early life heavily influenced his distorted view of the world and made him a serial killer. Psychiatrist Michael Stone referred to Richard as a made psychopath as opposed to a born psychopath. Further evaluation of Richard in adulthood revealed that his childhood trauma caused brain defects that manifested as schizophrenic personality disorder, hypersexuality, aggression, and temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause unprovoked seizures in adults. While Richard was in California, he began to carry out his crimes. He spent his first couple years in California relatively out of major trouble, but he was arrested a couple times for traffic violations and drug issues, but committed his first murder on April 10, 1984. Richard killed a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl named Mei Lung. Mei and her brother were wandering around outside looking for a lost dollar bill when Richard approached them and told Mei to follow him to the basement of the apartment building they lived in. Once in the basement, Richard proceeded to beat, strangle, and rape Mei. He then stabbed her multiple times and hung her lifeless body on a pipe. This crime would go unsolved for a while until about 2009, where DNA connected it back to Richard, but there is still a lack of evidence against him. This was the first of many more cold-blooded murders that Richard would go on to commit the following year, because just 2 months later, after murdering Mei, Richard would go on to break into the apartment of a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vinkow and then stab her viciously in the head, neck, and chest while she slept. When Jenny's body was found, her throat was slashed so deep that he almost fully decapitated her. Richard left a fingerprint in the mesh screen he made his way in from and started to establish a routine of brutalizing his victims and then robbing the homes to fund his cocaine addiction and pay his rent. Richard would lay low for a bit, but after about 9 months, come back to commit crimes at a rapid rate. About 9 months later, after the murder of Jenny Vinkow, on March 17, 1985, Richard attacked a 22-year-old woman named Maria Hernandez. Richard shot her point blank in the face with a .22 caliber handgun after she pulled into her garage in Rosemead, California. Maria survived the shot and laid on the ground playing dead while Richard made his way into the house. Inside the house, Richard spotted Maria's roommate, a 34-year-old woman named Dale Yoshi Okazaki. Richard pointed his gun at her and killed her instantly. Richard left the home and went to Monterey Park, where he pulled a 30-year-old woman named Veronica Yu out of her car and shot her twice, then quickly fled the scene. 2 murders and a failed third attempt on one day attracted extensive media coverage, and Richard was nicknamed the Walk-In Killer and the Valley Intruder. He was described as a curly-haired man with bulging eyes and rotting teeth. Just 10 days later, on March 27, 1985, Richard broke into another home in Whittier. Upon entering the home of a sleeping couple, he shot and killed the man named Charles Vincent Zazzara in his sleep. He then turned his attention to his wife, a 44-year-old woman named Maxine Lavinia Zazzara, who was now awake from the gunshot. Richard tied her hands together while he searched the room for valuables. Maxine managed to free herself from the ropes and managed to grab a shotgun hidden under the bed. She raised the gun, pointing it at Richard, and pulled the trigger. But unfortunately, the shotgun was not loaded. Richard, upon realizing he had almost lost his life, attacked Maxine in a fury, shot her multiple times, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and carved an inverted cross into her chest. Richard then proceeded to gouge Maxine's eyes out and store them in a jewelry box which he would keep as a souvenir until he was arrested. Richard attempted to have sex with Maxine's dead body, but was too shaken up by almost losing his life and decided to leave. On his way out, Richard would leave a footprint from his Avia sneakers in the flower bed near the window. These shoes would later be used to track Richard and form a profile on him. The bullet casings left behind by Richard were traced back to his earlier crimes, and police realized that they were dealing with a serial killer. Richard would go on to commit numerous more horrendous crimes. A month and a half later, On May 14th, 1985, Richard broke into the home of an elderly couple in Monterey Park named Bill and Lillian Doy. Richard shot Bill in the face and then beat him with his gun, bound a physically disabled Lillian and her, and then proceeded to rob the home. 2 weeks later, May 29th, 1985, Richard drove a stolen car to Monrovia into the home of 83-year-old Mabel Bell, who was with her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence Lang. Mabel and Florence were in separate rooms, and Richard used a hammer he found in the kitchen to bludgeon the women and used electrical cords to shock the women. Richard then raped Florence and used Mabel's lipstick to draw satanic pentagrams on the walls. Both women died at later dates in the hospital. The following day, May 30, 1985, Richard broke into a home in Burbank and handcuffed a 42-year-old woman named Carol Kyle and her 11-year-old son. Richard sent the boy away and raped Carol. Richard then robbed the home and left. July 2nd, 1985, Richard broke into the home of a 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon in Arcadia. Richard bludgeoned her with a lamp and stabbed her repeatedly in a frenzy and left. July 5th, 1985, Richard broke into a Sierra Madre home and bashed a 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron. Richard tried to strangle her with a telephone cord, but was shocked and saw electrical sparks. Richard fled and believed divine intervention was saving Whitney. She survived, but required a large number of stitches on her scalp. July 7th, 1985, Richard broke into the home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson and robbed her home. He then stomped her to death, leaving his Avia shoe print at the scene. Later that night, he broke into the home of 63-year-old Sophie Dickman, where he handcuffed her and stole her jewelry. He then had her swear on Satan that she had given him all she had. July 20, 1985, Richard had gotten a hold of a machete and broke into the Glendale home of Leela and Maxon Needing. Richard hacked away at them while they slept and robbed the home. That same night, he drove to Sun Valley and drove to the home of the Covenant family. Richard shot the father of the house while he slept and killed 32-year-old Chainarong Covenant. He then proceeded to rape and beat the mother of the house, Som Kid Covenant. Richard then bound their 8-year-old son, where he dragged Som Kid around the house to point him out to their valuables, and he then had her swear on Satan that she had revealed everything to him. August 6, 1985, Richard broke into a home in Northridge and attacked Chris and Virginia Peterson, a couple in their late 20s. He only managed to shoot each of them once, but struggled against Chris and broke free. He then proceeded to flee the home, and both of the Petersons survived. August 8th, 1985, in Diamond Bar, Richard broke into the home of Sakina and Elias Abawath. He shot and killed Elias in his sleep and handcuffed and threatened Sakina to reveal the locations of valuables in the home. He then had her swear on Satan that she had revealed everything to him. Then he proceeded to tie up their 3-year-old son and still raped Sakina. All of these vicious crimes happened in a span of roughly 4 months in Los Angeles County, so media coverage was heavy and the Night Stalker was attracting a lot of attention, so Richard decided to head for San Francisco. August 18th, 1985, Richard did his usual routine on a couple in their 60s in San Francisco. Their names were Peter and Barbara Pan. Richard left his shoe print at the scene of the crime. By this time, police were trying to solve the case of the Night Stalker and capture him. 2 detectives were on the case named Frank Salerno and Gil Correa. They contacted Avia Manufacturing and realized that the Avia shoe was uncommon, and more importantly, that only one pair of size 11.5s were shipped to Los Angeles for sale. This was a breakthrough in the case because the shoe prints, which had been found in Los Angeles, were found in San Francisco, and more importantly, were on an uncommon shoe, meaning that the owner of the Avia sneakers was the Night Stalker. Unfortunately, the mayor of San Francisco leaked this information to the public and hurt the case. In a press conference, San Francisco's mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, revealed the shoe and gun caliber that Richard used. Richard, who was following the case, got rid of his shoes, threw them over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge, and laid low before heading back to Los Angeles. On August 25th, 1985, Richard made his way all the way down south to Mission Viejo. Richard was creeping on a home where he was planning to break into Luckily, a 13-year-old boy named James was awake and noticed someone prowling around the property and alerted his parents. The father raced outside and managed to scare off Richard, thinking he was a regular thief. Richard fled and ended up at the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson, where Richard shot Bill in the head 3 times and then turned to Inez, where he introduced himself as the Night Stalker. And then Richard forced her to swear her love for Satan. Richard then did what he usually does and made her swear on Satan that she revealed all she had. Before leaving, Richard instructed Inez to tell them that the Night Stalker was here. Bill later survived the attack. Inez Erickson, of course, contacted the police and managed to give a detailed and accurate description of Richard. This, bundled together with his footprints and another fingerprint on a stolen car he abandoned in Koreatown, was being used to tie it all back to him. Richard's fingerprint was in a computer system after being arrested for traffic and drug violations beforehand. And on August 29, 1985, police officially released a mugshot of Richard from a traffic violation and declared him the Night Stalker. The police then went on to state, "We know who you are now, and soon everybody else will. There will be no place you can hide." On August 30th, 1985, the following day after police had released a warrant for Richard's arrest and issued a photo of him, Richard left town to Tucson, Arizona, where he was going to visit one of his brothers. Completely unaware that he had become the target of a citywide manhunt, he returned back to LA on August 31st. Upon returning, he actually walked past 2 police officers who were closely watching outbound buses in an attempt to catch the Night Stalker trying to flee the city. Richard ended up walking into a convenience store in East Los Angeles, and to his surprise, Richard noticed a group of old Hispanic ladies visibly scared of him and uttering the words El Matador, which means the killer in English. Richard looked around and noticed a newspaper with his face on the front page and with big bold letters saying The Night Stalker. Richard ran out of the store in a panic, bolting across the Santa Ana freeway, and tried to steal a car, but 2 nearby residents of the area pulled him out of the car he was trying to steal. Richard struggled against them and managed to slip out of grasp and ran across the street to try and take the keys from a woman getting into her car. The woman's husband saw this and managed to strike Richard on the head with a piece of wood. Richard managed to stay conscious and tried to run away, but by this point, a commotion had already broken out, and a small mob, about 10 people, chased Richard down Hubbard Street in Boyle Heights. The mob got a hold of him and beat him down in the streets. Police were called to the area over a disturbance and took a viciously beaten Richard into custody. Richard spent 3 years in jail until his court trial, which began on July 22nd, 1988. At his first court appearance, Richard raised his hand, which he had drawn a pentagram on, and yelled, "Hail Satan." Richard's trial was not as eventful as other high-profile court hearings, but some noteworthy things worth mentioning was some guards had apparently heard Richard state that he would shoot the prosecutor with the gun he was having smuggled into the courtroom and cause security to be tightened and put the whole courtroom on edge. Another was that one of the jurors had been shot and killed in her home, which sent prosecutors and jurors into a panic, wondering if Richard had orchestrated a hit from inside of his cell. It turned out to be false, and the juror had been killed by her boyfriend, who later committed suicide with the same gun he used to kill his girlfriend with. And on September 20th, 1989, Richard was convicted of 43 charges, which included 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. And on November 7th, 1989, Richard was sentenced to death by the gas chamber in California, to which Richard later told the press, "Big deal, death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." At the time, the Night Stalker trial cost $1.8 million, which was the most expensive trial in the history of California until the O.J. Simpson trial in 1994. During his trial, Richard had amassed a following. People would idolize him and write him letters and even visit him while he was in jail awaiting trial. Among those fans was a woman named Doreen Leoy, who wrote a total of 75 times to Richard during his incarceration. And in 1988, Richard proposed to Doreen, which she accepted, and on October 3rd, 1996, Richard and Doreen were married inside San Quentin State Prison. They divorced. It's unknown when, but by the time of Richard's death in 2013, he was engaged to another 23-year-old woman. Richard was denied for appeals throughout the years and had his requests for rehearings denied. Most of Richard's time in prison was uneventful. He started to develop serious health conditions, and on June 7th, 2013, Richard Ramirez died to complications from B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. His body was cremated since no one came forward to claim it. Richard Ramirez died alone and abandoned. Not even his family came forward to claim his body after he had died. Richard Ramirez claimed to have killed more people than he was convicted of at one point, but it was never proven or followed up on.
I think most humans have in them the capacity to commit murder. It is not because...
No, we don't, Richard.
They choose not to, not because they are morally superior, as they so commonly claim, but because they are imprisoned in a web of responsibilities, commitments, beliefs, and sentiments.
Richard.
And that would render murder an absurd gamble or ridiculous self-destruction.
Richard Ramirez committed multiple horrible crimes and never once showed an ounce of regret. And now, his name lives on as one of California's worst serial killers, earning him the nickname the Night Stalker. Thank you for watching.